When I was in the 8th grade, my best friend Sean moved away. Me and all my friends were sad to see him go. It was just after Christmas when he left, and his new home would be a small town on the other side of the country. It might as well have been on the other side of the world. I was pretty upset for a while, but when summer came, my parents finally agreed to let me visit him, something I'd been begging for since the move. I was 14 years old by then, so they said it was okay for me to fly alone. I was scared at first, but made it there, and Sean and his mom picked me up at the airport. The drive to his town was about 2 hours, and the whole way there, Sean was telling me everything about his new life. He missed everyone, of course, but he had made some new friends already. His house was on the edge of town. It was a modest 2-story building with a 2-car garage. His mom had set up a room for me in their basement, which was cool and slightly damp. Not bad at all, though. I liked the privacy. The town itself was very different from the suburb that I came from. It almost felt like one of those old West ghost towns that you sometimes see on TV. Most businesses downtown were closed, and there were many buildings with windows boarded up. Sean and I walked the streets on my first day, exploring. There were some people out, but it was definitely a quieter place than my home. The only really successful business in that town was the mine, which is where Sean's dad was working. I wasn't allowed to see it up close, but Sean told me that it was pretty cool. He also told me that there was an old mine near the town, which had been closed for many years. You couldn't get very close to the actual pit, but there were some buildings around there that some of the other guys told Sean about. He had never been there himself. Sean introduced me to some of his new friends, James and Tanner. They were 2 years older than us, and had a rough edge to them. Tanner was smoking a cigarette when we first met, even though he was only 16, and we were right out in the open on the street. They attended the same school as Sean, and they were even in the same class. It's because the school was so small that they grouped different grades together. We hung out just the 4 of us that night. James and Tanner were constantly bragging about all the cool stuff they had done. I use the term cool loosely, because really all they were doing was talking about getting into trouble and disrespecting their parents. Needless to say, I didn't like James and Tanner, but I didn't want to ruin my visit with Sean, so I kept my mouth shut and tried to tolerate them. On my 3rd night, the 4 of us were hanging out in the schoolyard, a big area with rusting playground equipment and overgrown grass. When it was starting to get dark, Tanner suggested that we explore the old mine. The others agreed, so there we went. We biked to the mine as the sun was setting. It took us just over half an hour to get there. By the time we arrived, the sun was completely down. The actual pit was surrounded by a pretty serious barbed wire fence. We walked around for a bit, shining our flashlights in, trying to see something, but it was hard to make out much. The moon was out, but its light was not enough to see into the pit. Outside of the fence, there was an old building, probably an office building for the mine, so we went to check that out. Tanner and James mentioned that they had been through there a few times before, and there was something they wanted to show us. The front door was broken down and hanging from a single hinge, so we squeezed past it and went into the building. As soon as I stepped inside, a horrible smell hit me. It was like a mix between raw sewage and a dead raccoon. It was hard to keep from gagging, but it didn't seem to bother the others as much. As we continued walking, the smell only got worse, but I tried to ignore it and kept up with the group. Tanner lit up a cigarette, and that was probably the first time I'd ever actually enjoyed the smell of smoke. We explored a few rooms along the way. They were all full of empty beer cans and liquor bottles. I even saw a syringe on the floor in one of the rooms. I was just old enough to understand what that meant. Eventually, we reached a door at the far end of the hall. James opened it and gestured for me to go in first. I looked over to my friend and the other 2 guys. Not wanting to look scared, I stepped through. As soon as I was in, someone slammed the door shut behind me. I felt terrified, but I tried to stay calm. The smell in the room was overpowering, and I struggled to breathe. I tried to force the door open with a few slams from my shoulder, but I was no match for the older boys. I gave up and stopped, not wanting to give them the satisfaction of listening to me beg or scream. I then turned around to look at the room. There was a window on the other end, and some light from the moon spilled in. When my eyes adjusted, I saw it. A body lying on the floor, partially decomposed. My heart raced, and I pounded on the door, screaming for them to let me out. I could hear them laughing at me from the other side of the door, but I couldn't help myself. Then Sean's voice came through, telling him that it was enough. The door then swung open. James and Tanner were laughing hysterically. I was shaking uncontrollably. How could they think that was a joke? There was a dead person in there, and they knew about it. I was still angry as we made our way to our bikes, but James and Tanner still thought it was a joke. I managed to calm down after a few minutes and asked James if they killed him. He said no, and that they stumbled upon it weeks ago. He thought it'd be funny to scare me. When we got back, I told Sean's mom everything. The police were called, and the body was recovered. It turned out to be a missing person from a neighboring town. James and Tanner lied to the police, denying any knowledge of the body prior to that night. They were never held accountable, and the police seemed to believe them. They even tried to spin it like they were some kind of heroes for finding a missing person. God, I hated them. The only good news is that they were probably telling the truth about not killing the person. I heard that the police determined the death to be drug-related, something that's all too common. For the rest of my stay, I told Sean I didn't want to see those guys again. He was understanding, but afterwards he continued to hang out with them. I went back home and rarely talked about what happened. Sean and I drifted apart soon after, and within a year, we stopped talking completely. It's been 15 years now, and I don't know what happened to him. I hope the best for him, but with the kinds of friends he had, I worry. I grew up in Northern Ontario, Canada. My town had a population of just over 2,500 people, so by most people's standards, it was pretty small. That being said, it was one of the bigger towns in my area. There were some communities around there under 1,000. My town had little more than a post office and a few restaurants. It was on the rail line though, so we did have a train station. It was on the far end of our town, and on the other side of the tracks, there was nothing but trees. We weren't supposed to go near the tracks because it can be dangerous. Only a few trains would come through most days though, and you could see them coming from a good distance, so we didn't hesitate to play around on the tracks occasionally. One afternoon, I was hanging out with my friend Shane. We were hopping around from one wooden tie to another, and I noticed a man walking through the woods on the other side of the tracks. He was just a shadowy figure, moving slowly, almost blending into the trees. What struck me as odd was that in our small community, a new face was rare, and the man didn't look familiar. We thought it was weird, but he disappeared soon after, and we let it go. I thought we should tell someone, but Shane didn't want to. I should mention that I was 15 years old, and Shane was 17. The next week over dinner, my dad mentioned that there was a break-in down our street. Our neighbor whose house it was out of town when it happened, but when he came home, the lock on his back door was broken, and there were signs that somebody had been there. There were muddy footprints throughout his house, and several things were broken, a lamp and some dishes. The place wasn't completely trashed, just a few things. The creepy part is that our neighbor thought somebody had been living in his house while he was away. He said nothing was stolen, but the fact that somebody broke into his house while he was away was alarming. My dad made me promise to be extra careful, especially at night. The incident sent a ripple through our little town, but as weeks passed, without another incident, life slowly returned to normal. I was happy about that, because it was boring when we weren't allowed to go out. Shane and I were hanging out in the woods one day, just going for a walk and talking. It was summer, so it was hot and the black flies were bad, but we grew up with that, so we were used to it. We weren't far away from our town when we saw a man in the woods. He was far away, but it reminded us of that day on the tracks. We kept walking and ignored him. At that moment, we didn't know who it was. It may very well have been one of our friends or something. After a while, the man got closer. He began walking towards us. When he was around 20 meters away, we got scared. His clothes were tattered, and we were pretty sure we didn't recognize him. There was something about the man that screamed danger, so without a word, Shane and I turned and ran as fast as our legs could carry us, not stopping until we were back in the heart of our town. When I got home, I told my dad, thinking the man might have had something to do with the break-in. He called the police, but they didn't find anything. The forest was vast out there, and even though we were close to town, it would have taken a whole search team to do anything. We didn't even have any evidence that the man was involved. The next morning, though, another break-in was reported. This time, however, it was much worse. One of our neighbors had been found dead in his home. Nobody knew at the time, but it was eventually ruled a murder. All signs were that it was the same culprit as the first break-in. The lock on the back door was broken in the same way, and there were muddy footprints similar to the first crime. The police were even able to match the footprints. The town was in shock. Nothing like that had ever happened before. Crime was a problem in our town, but nothing close to this. Strangely, much like the first break-in, nothing was stolen. The car was still there, and many valuables were still left in the house. Shane and I went to the police station ourselves this time. We told them about the man we had seen in the woods, and how he appeared both times, near the days of the break-ins. The police searched, but the man was not found. If he was hiding in those woods, it would have been almost impossible to find him. Tensions were high for months, maybe years afterwards. Nobody knew if the murderer was still in our town, or if he moved on. This all happened over 10 years ago, and it's still a mystery. Shane and I think we ran into a murderer on 2 separate occasions, but we could never prove it. How close we came to being his next victim is also uncertain, but the perspective we have now makes the whole thing a lot creepier. I used to live in the city, but I bought a house that was about 4 hours away. I still had 2 months on the lease for my apartment, so instead of trying to find someone to sublet, I decided to keep the apartment and move over slowly with just my car. Then I would borrow my dad's truck for the bigger stuff. I would drive out to my house on the weekends with a carload of my stuff. My parents were on the way there, so I would turn each trip into a visit as well. I was heading to my property on a Friday night in June and planning to spend the night there. The roads were nearly empty, which was usual for this area. It was 11 p.m., and it was pitch dark with no street lamps or moonlight. That's when I first noticed a car in my rearview mirror. It wasn't just following me, it was tailgating me so closely that I could barely see with the headlights in my mirror. At first I tried to ignore him. Maybe the driver was just in a hurry, I thought. But when I switched lanes to let him pass, he didn't. Instead, the other car stuck to my bumper, matching every turn I made. I wasn't on a well-traveled road, so there were really only the 2 of us out there. I even tried slowing to well below the speed limit, hoping that would make him pass, but that didn't work either. There was no cell reception on that road, so all I could do was keep driving. I knew there was a town coming up, so if it came to that, then I would pull off and try to find help. The car stayed with me for another 10 minutes, and then up ahead, the turnoff for the small town appeared. I hoped that if I could get to a more populated area, then this tailgater would back off. So I made the turn off the highway, hoping that he wouldn't follow, but he did, not surprisingly at all, considering what he had done already. Driving through the town, I kept checking my mirror. The other car was still there. When I was at a stop sign, I peeked at my phone and saw that I had service. I was about to call the cops, but I looked up and saw the town's police station. It looked closed, but I was sure somebody had to be there. I pulled into the parking lot, thinking for sure the other car wouldn't follow, but he did. I pulled my car into the closest spot to the building and quickly dialed 911 from my cell phone. I watched the other car enter the lot, keeping a distance, but blocking the only exit. I was really worried that nobody was there. If that was the case, then all I would have done was box myself into the parking lot. The dispatcher was still on the line, and I told her where I was. She told me that help was on the way, but I didn't know how far they were, or if the police station was actually closed. I didn't think police stations were ever closed, but what do I know? When I looked back to the car, I saw a man jump out of the driver's seat and start walking towards me. He left his car there, blocking the only exit. He wasn't rushing, just walking towards my car with a strange confidence. It was terrifying. Just as he was getting close, 2 cops came out of the station. They looked surprised to see us, but they wasted no time in approaching. The man suddenly changed his demeanor, acting confused and scared. He walked over to the cops. I could see them talking, and he pointed over to my car. There was no way for me to know what the man was telling them, but I would find out soon. After a few minutes, one of the officers came to my car. I rolled down the window and talked to him. I found out that the man told the cops that I had been following him, making wild claims that I was some sort of stalker. I knew the truth, though, and thought the fact that his car was blocking the exit to the parking lot looked pretty suspicious for him. The situation was surreal. There I was thinking I was the one in danger, and suddenly, I was being questioned as if I was the perpetrator. The cops were skeptical of the man, but they had to follow procedure. They checked both of our stories and ran both of our licenses. As it turned out, the car wasn't even his. It was reported stolen a few days ago in a town 50 miles away. The man's story was falling apart. After that, they let me go, apologizing for the whole ordeal. They explained that the man was likely involved in some shady activities, might have mistaken me for someone else, or maybe he was just looking for trouble. I tend to think it was the latter. I wouldn't have been surprised if he was also drunk, but that would have been for the police to figure out. The next day, I called the police station to follow up. The man had been wanted in connection with several crimes in the area. It was just a case of being in the wrong place at the wrong time, but it could have ended much worse. I still drive that road sometimes, because it leads between my place and my parents'. It's always creepy to remember that experience whenever I'm on that road, alone. This happened when I was in high school. I grew up in a small mountain town of about 1,000 people. There were many kids there, but I did have some good friends. Josh was one of them, and he was there when this all happened. Since our school was small, everyone knew each other, all the way from the youngest to the oldest students. Even though our town was beautiful, it wasn't without its problems. Crime was a constant problem, and so were drugs. The two go hand in hand a lot of the time anyway. There were a few guys at our school who were known for that kind of stuff. Jay and Perry were two of them. They were usually alright to me and my friends, because we always minded our own business and never got into theirs. The woods in our town were fantastic, and every weekend I would go out and explore different parts with my friends, or even by myself. Josh and I were on the trail in the early afternoon on a Saturday. We were just walking and talking. It was an overcast day, but not raining. It was November, so it was kind of cold, and we both had a thick jacket and hat. As we turned a bend in the trail, we saw two people up ahead in the distance. We couldn't tell who they were at first, but after another minute, we could tell that it was Jay and Perry, with another guy who we couldn't recognize. Josh was always the more cautious one, so he suggested that we turn back, but I thought we should keep going. I told him that they were all right, and they wouldn't bother us. He was hesitant, but agreed. We continued our walk, but I will admit that my nerves were tense. That's when it happened. Two loud bangs blasted our ears. Instinctively, I shouted out, "What the hell?" Then I hit the ground and pulled Josh down with me. We laid there for a moment that felt like an eternity. We were trying to figure out what happened. At first, I thought the guys were just messing around with a gun, as crazy as that sounds. This was a hiking trail, and a lot of people used it. It would have been 100% illegal to practice shooting out there. Still, we didn't think it was anything more than that. Josh then nudged me and pointed to a tree nearby. There was an unmistakable bullet hole at around head level. Someone had shot at us. This wasn't some prank. It was real and was dangerous. Right then, I knew we had to get out of there, but that wasn't going to happen. We could hear footsteps approaching. I braced myself, expecting the worst, but then I heard them speak.
"Hey, sorry, we didn't mean to scare you guys."
It was Jay and Perry, and they were out of breath. They tried to play it off as an accident.
"We were just messing around. We didn't think anybody was out there,"
Jay said. Perry then chimed in.
"Yeah, we were aiming for the tree. We didn't realize you guys were on the trail."
Their words did little to calm us down. Josh and I exchanged glances, both of us thinking the same thing. We needed to get out of there fast. There was something about them that didn't sit right. Their apologies did sound sincere, but there was no way that an accident so bad could just happen. Like I said before, target practice was completely out of the question on that trail. Also, they were too young to own a gun anyway. Considering the stuff they were into, though, I guess the gun was unlicensed. Josh and I nodded and said it was okay, and then hurried back the way we came. I could feel their eyes on us as we walked, but we just kept going. I was half expecting to be shot down as I walked, but luckily, they let us go. The rest of the walk back was tense. We spoke little, both lost in our thoughts. When we finally emerged from the woods, the sun was starting to set. When I got home, I didn't tell my parents what happened. It may sound stupid to some people, but you simply don't tell on people where I come from, even for something so serious. About a week later, Jay was reported missing. Our school principal made the announcement, and as soon as I heard, I thought of that day in the woods. As it turned out, he was found dead in those very woods, only about a week later. The cause of death was undetermined, but it was eventually ruled an accident, and that he died of hypothermia. I have my doubts, though. I've had some time to think about it, and my guess is that the shots were an honest mistake, but not in the way they had described it. I think they saw us coming, but they thought we were someone else. When I shouted out, they must have realized it was me. When you get involved in sketchy stuff, bad things happen, and those guys were in deep, it seems. Perry and their other friends never said a word about either incident again. After Jay's death, the school was changed. Some of my friends thought it was just an accident, but a few of us thought there was more to it than that. As for who the killer was, there aren't many choices, so in my opinion, he was still among us.